He had always been someone who valued discipline and order, a person who took pride in every detail of his life. Serving in the military had shaped him in ways that nothing else could, teaching him patience, strategy, and the importance of planning ahead. It was a late summer morning when he started preparing for his next deployment. The air was heavy, warm, and buzzing with the sounds of the neighborhood, but he barely noticed it. His mind was focused on the responsibilities that awaited him abroad, and the steps he needed to take to ensure that his home was secured during his absence. Before leaving, he carefully reviewed every aspect of his house. It wasn't just a building with walls and furniture, it was the place where memories had been built, a place that represented years of hard work, dedication, and sacrifice. He had invested time, money, and love into making it feel like a true home. Knowing that he would be away for months, possibly longer, he felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He wanted to leave everything in order, to make sure that when he returned, he would find everything exactly as he had left it. He started by checking every lock, every window, every corner that could be a potential weak point. He took photographs, made notes, and even asked a trusted neighbor to keep an eye on the property. The neighbor was someone he trusted completely, someone who had lived in the community for decades and had always been reliable. He explained clearly that the house was off limits, that no one was to enter or make any changes. He wanted to ensure that no one could claim ignorance if something went wrong. Next, he reviewed his agreement with the Homeowners Association. The HOA had always seemed professional and attentive, enforcing rules, collecting fees, and maintaining the neighborhood's appearance. He made sure that all fees were up to date, that all communication was documented, and that the HOA had clear instructions about his absence. In his mind, this was a simple precaution. He assumed that the organization existed to support homeowners, not to take advantage of them. The thought that the HOA might act otherwise never crossed his mind. Packing his belongings for deployment was straightforward, but his mind kept returning to the house. He wondered if the neighbor would notice anything unusual, if the garden would survive the heat, and if the small repairs he had left behind would hold up. He checked the locks one more time, went through the house room by room, made a list of everything that needed attention upon his return. Each item on the list was a small effort to protect his sanctuary. Finally, he left a set of keys and the list with his neighbor, trusting that they would follow his instructions to the letter. The day he departed was filled with a quiet tension. He hugged his family tightly, said goodbye to friends, and reminded himself that this mission was part of something larger than his personal concerns. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, there was a seed of worry about the house. That worry would have been normal for anyone, but he trusted in preparation and discipline to keep it at bay. He left with a sense of purpose, believing that the home he had worked so hard to maintain would remain untouched. As weeks turned into months, he settled into the rhythm of military life. Days were long, structured, and intense. There were drills, meetings, and missions that demanded his full attention. Slowly, the anxiety about the house faded into the background, replaced by focus and determination to perform his duties well. Letters and emails from home kept him connected, brief snapshots of the life he had temporarily left behind. His neighbor occasionally updated him about small things, a garden flower blooming, a minor repair completed, nothing alarming. Nothing that would hint at the storm that was brewing silently. He had a small routine to check in on his property remotely. He would call the neighbor, review the emails from the HOA, and make sure that his instructions were being followed. Everything seemed normal, just as he had planned. The neighborhood looked the same in the photos sent to him, the house appeared untouched, and his peace of mind grew. He allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction, a quiet acknowledgement that his careful planning was working. He had left his home in capable hands. Believing fully that it was protected, one afternoon, during a routine video call with a colleague, a casual mention of his house caught his attention. The colleague mentioned something about tenants in the neighborhood, a passing comment that seemed trivial at first, but it stuck with him, nagging at the edges of his mind. He shrugged it off initially, attributing it to coincidence, but later, the thought returned and lingered. Something didn't feel right. He decided to investigate further, but he had no reason yet to suspect anything serious. It was only a small seed of doubt, barely noticeable against the background of his busy life. The weeks continued, each passing day reinforcing his belief that he had done everything correctly. The neighbors' updates remained consistent, the HOA's communication professional, and the house seemingly undisturbed. He focused on his assignments, thinking that any worry about home was simply a distraction. Yet deep down, there was a part of him that remained vigilant, trained to notice anomalies, trained to prepare for the unexpected. Little did he know that the true test of his patience and discipline was about to begin, a challenge that no amount of planning could fully anticipate as the deployment progressed. He received an unexpected email from someone claiming to be from the HOA. The tone was casual, almost friendly, but the content raised a small red flag. The email mentioned the property and hinted at arrangements that were unusual. He reread it several times, trying to make sense of the vague language. Something was off. His instincts, honed by years of military training, warned him that this was the first sign of a problem. He documented the email, saved every detail, and began to formulate questions he would ask upon his return. The seed of doubt had grown into a small but tangible concern. Despite the unease, he continued his duties with full focus. The military environment demanded attention, and he could not allow personal matters to interfere. Still, he remained watchful, keeping mental notes of every anomaly, however minor. He reviewed his instructions to the HOA, revisited his documentation, and reminded himself that he had left everything in order. The juxtaposition of confidence and concern created a tension he could not ignore. He understood that preparation alone might not be enough. Vigilance was equally essential. In the quiet moments, he reflected on the trust he had placed in others. Trust was necessary, but it was never blind. Every instruction, every precaution, every piece of documentation was a layer of protection. He had done his part with precision and care. The possibility that someone might exploit the situation seemed remote, almost unthinkable. Yet, as a trained officer, he knew that complacency was dangerous. He remained alert, recording thoughts, making mental notes, and preparing for contingencies. The careful balance of trust and caution defined his approach. Life on deployment moved forward relentlessly. Missions, responsibilities, and routine filled the days. Still, the house lingered in his thoughts, not as a distraction, but as a matter of principle. It was not just about property or money. It was about respect, ownership, and the integrity of agreements. The idea that someone could violate that principle disturbed him more than any threat he faced abroad. It was a matter of honor, a challenge to the sense of order he had cultivated in his life. He continued to correspond with his neighbor and the HOA, asking questions casually, seeking reassurance without revealing the depth of his concern. The responses were polite, seemingly cooperative, and nothing concrete suggested wrongdoing. He allowed himself a cautious optimism, but he knew better than to accept appearances at face value. Years of experience had taught him that true understanding came from observation, verification, and preparation. Trust was given carefully, and he remained alert, ready to act if the situation changed. As the weeks wore on, a strange feeling settled over him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Something in the behavior of the HOA seemed too casual, too confident, too free of accountability. He could not pinpoint it, but his instincts, sharpened by years of military service, hinted that his home might be at risk. He began keeping a more detailed record of every interaction, every email, every update. He prepared mentally for a confrontation he hoped would never come. Understanding that readiness was as important as trust, by the time the deployment reached its midpoint, he had a detailed mental map of the situation at home. Every precaution he had taken was in place. Every instruction had been communicated, yet a shadow of doubt remained. The seed planted months ago was growing quietly, preparing to reveal a reality that would challenge his patience and strategy. He remained disciplined, focusing on his duties while mentally preparing for the moment when his vigilance would be tested. The calm before the storm had settled, and he was ready to face whatever came next, relying on the careful planning and unwavering patience that had defined his approach to life. He had been overseas for months when the first true shock arrived. It was a simple phone call from the neighbor, the kind of call he had always welcomed for updates about the garden or minor house issues. But this time, the tone was different, uncertain, and nervous. The neighbor hesitated, choosing words carefully, as if weighing whether to tell him the truth. Finally, they said, almost in a whisper, that someone had been living in his house. At first, he thought he misheard. Living in his house? That made no sense. The HOA had been given strict instructions. His home was off limits. No leasing, no subletting, no access. Everything had been documented, every precaution taken. How could this happen? His mind raced, but military training taught him to remain calm, to gather facts before acting. He asked questions carefully, trying to understand exactly what had occurred. The neighbor explained that the HOA had apparently rented the home to a tenant, citing some obscure clause in the association rules. It was shocking, illegal, and unbelievable. The feeling that rose in him was not pure anger at first. It was disbelief, like seeing a friend betray you in slow motion. He went over every detail in his mind, recalling every email, every conversation, every precaution he had taken. Everything seemed so clear. How could the HOA misrepresent his property like this? How could they have the audacity to rent it without his consent? His trust had been violated, and it felt personal, as if the very principle he lived by had been challenged. He knew that reacting impulsively would be a mistake. In the military, making decisions in the heat of emotion could have devastating consequences. He reminded himself to breathe, to analyze, to record. He started documenting every detail of what the neighbor told him, every word of the call, every uncertainty. He realized he needed proof, evidence that could stand up in court if it came to that. This was no longer a hypothetical concern, it was a violation, a betrayal, and he needed to treat it with the seriousness it deserved. The neighbor continued cautiously, explaining that the tenants seemed unaware of the legal situation. They had been led to believe that the HOA had the right to place them there temporarily. He listened, absorbing every detail, and quietly formulated a plan. He would need to verify the legality of this arrangement, understand the financial implications, and determine whether any other violations had occurred. The HOA's casual confidence no longer seemed harmless, now seemed dangerous, manipulative, and possibly criminal. Over the next few days, he spent hours reviewing the HOA agreements from his laptop, reading every clause with careful attention. Each line of the contract, every fine print detail, became a tool he could use. There was no clause that gave them the authority to rent his house without explicit consent. He cross-referenced state property laws and HOA regulations, taking meticulous notes. Each piece of information reinforced what he already knew. The HOA had overstepped, and they were assuming he would never find out. They were wrong. He also started gathering digital evidence, saving emails, screenshots, and any online records he could find. Military life had trained him to be methodical and thorough, and he approached this situation with the same discipline. Even from thousands of miles away, he felt a strange sense of control. The initial shock and disbelief were transforming into strategy. He reminded himself that patience and preparation would be more effective than anger. His training had always taught him to strike decisively, but only when the time was right. The thought of the house being lived in by strangers stirred a mix of emotions. There was violation, of course, and concern for the condition of the property. He pictured the rooms he had maintained so carefully, imagining them being used without care or respect. There was also a sense of betrayal, a deep frustration that an organization he had trusted could act so boldly against him. And yet, amidst all this, there was a growing resolve. He would make things right, not recklessly, but with precision and strategy. He reached out to a legal contact, someone experienced in military property issues and HOA disputes. Explaining the situation without letting emotion take over, he laid out the facts. The unauthorized rental, the lack of consent, and the potential financial losses. The legal contact listened carefully, acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. They discussed possible actions, from formal notices to inspections, and began drafting a plan that would protect his rights. Even from afar, he felt the first flickers of empowerment. Knowledge and preparation, he reminded himself, were far more powerful than immediate confrontation while arranging legal guidance. He also began documenting the potential financial consequences. Rent had been collected, presumably by the HOA, and he had received nothing. Beyond money, there was the potential damage to his home, both physically and reputationally, if word spread that it had been mismanaged. Each fact, each calculation, was another layer of evidence he would later use to hold the HOA accountable. His mind was no longer clouded with shock. It was focused, sharp, and disciplined. The longer he stayed in the loop, the clearer the extent of the issue became. The HOA had acted as though they were untouchable, as if the distance in his military service made him powerless. They had underestimated the combination of discipline, patience, and strategy that his training had instilled. What they saw as an opportunity for quick gain, he recognized as a temporary advantage that could be turned against them. This realization steeled his resolve. The violation of trust had become a challenge to overcome, and he would approach it the same way he approached every mission, with focus, intelligence, and careful planning. Every interaction with the HOA from this point on was documented meticulously. Emails were read multiple times, responses were saved, and any hint of negligence or overreach was highlighted. He treated it as if preparing for a critical operation, where each piece of information was a strategic advantage. The initial disbelief had faded entirely, replaced by methodical determination. The anger he had felt in the first moments of the call was now being channeled into actionable steps. Despite the distance, he found ways to monitor his property indirectly. Friends and trusted neighbors became his eyes and ears, providing updates on the tenants, the property, and the general state of affairs. Every observation was logged, every detail scrutinized. He learned to see the situation as a puzzle, with each piece contributing to a complete picture. What had once seemed like an overwhelming problem was gradually transforming into a challenge he could control, one step at a time. He also started mentally preparing for the day he would return. The thought of confronting the HOA directly, of seeing the tenants in his home, of reclaiming what was his, required careful planning. He knew that emotions could be a liability if not managed carefully. Military life had taught him to act decisively, but only after gathering intelligence, assessing risks, and choosing the optimal moment. The same principles applied now. He could feel a growing sense of calm confidence, born from preparation and foresight. As the days passed, he maintained a strict routine, balancing his military duties with careful oversight of the situation at home. Emails, calls, and documents were carefully reviewed each day, and every anomaly noted. The HOA, still unaware of his growing awareness and preparation, continued to act as if nothing was wrong. They believed his absence meant weakness. He knew it meant opportunity. The balance of power, invisible for now, was quietly shifting in his favor. He also began reflecting on the nature of trust and authority. The HOA had assumed they could overreach, taking liberties with a property that was not theirs. Their actions were a reminder that authority could be challenged, that discipline and strategy mattered more than temporary power. He felt a mix of satisfaction and resolve at this realization. The violation of his home was not just a personal affront. It was a lesson in vigilance, a test of his patience, and an opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of measured, deliberate action, even with all the planning and strategy. A small part of him could not help but imagine the confrontation to come. How would the tenants react? How would the HOA explain themselves? What would it feel like to reclaim the home that had been taken from him without permission? These questions lingered, unspoken, as he continued his duties abroad. He reminded himself constantly that the answers would come in due time, and that patience and preparation would ensure the best outcome. The house, the tenants, the HOA were all pieces of a problem he was uniquely prepared to solve. By the end of this period, he had shifted from shock to strategy, from disbelief to determination. Every action he had taken, every precaution, every document, and every phone call was a step toward reclaiming what was rightfully his. The initial betrayal, once a source of frustration and anger, had become a catalyst for careful, disciplined planning. He knew that when the time came to act, he would do so with precision, turning the violation of trust into a lesson in accountability, strategy, and resilience. Once he realized the HOA had rented his house without permission, he knew that anger alone would not solve anything. Years of military training had taught him that a calm, strategic mind always triumphed over impulse. From thousands of miles away, he began planning his response with the precision and discipline that had carried him through countless operations. Every step had to be measured, every detail considered. This was not just about reclaiming his property, it was about making sure that justice was done. Without giving anyone the chance to outmaneuver him, the first thing he did was gather every piece of information he could find. Emails, letters, notices, and HOA documents were combed over meticulously. Every word was scrutinized, every clause examined. He knew that these documents could be the key to proving the HOA's overreach. He made a detailed list of the violations, cross-referencing HOA rules with state property laws. Each entry on the list was like a small weapon in a larger plan. The thought that the HOA had acted with confidence, assuming he would not challenge them, only fueled his resolve. He also reached out to a legal expert experienced in military property issues and HOA disputes. The conversation was calm and professional, devoid of emotion. He explained the situation step by step, presenting the evidence he had collected and asking for guidance on the best legal approach. The expert listened, offering insight into HOA regulations, tenant rights, and legal remedies. Together, they began crafting a plan that would ensure his property was returned and the HOA held accountable. The officer knew that timing would be critical. Acting too soon or too late could jeopardize the entire effort. Meanwhile, he maintained constant communication with his trusted neighbor, the eyes and ears on the ground. He asked for updates on the tenants, the condition of the house, and any unusual activity. Each report was logged and compared to his documentation. He was building a clear, detailed picture of the situation, leaving no gaps for the HOA to exploit. The neighbor, initially nervous, began to see the methodical nature of his approach and became increasingly confident in his guidance. Together, they formed a quiet but effective team. As he organized the facts, he also began considering the financial impact. Rent had been collected without his consent, and there was a real possibility of property damage. Every dollar lost and every potential repair became part of the broader strategy. He calculated not only what was owed, but also the penalties the HOA could face under the law. This was not about revenge in a reckless sense. It was about holding people accountable for their actions. The officer understood that careful planning would yield far greater results than impulsive confrontation. To reinforce his strategy, he created a timeline of events. When the house had been rented, what communications had occurred, and the sequence of actions taken by the HOA were all documented in detail. This timeline would later serve as a key tool, showing a clear pattern of misconduct. Each step on the timeline reinforced his position, making it nearly impossible for the HOA to claim ignorance. The meticulousness of the plan reflected his military mindset. Every detail mattered. Every fact was a potential advantage, even while stationed abroad. He could not ignore the emotional aspect of the situation. There was a personal violation in the knowledge that strangers were living in his home without consent. Memories of the house, the mornings spent in the kitchen, quiet afternoons in the living room, the nights spent in peaceful rest fueled his determination. He allowed himself to feel that emotional weight, but never let it drive his decisions. Instead, he used it as motivation to ensure that justice was achieved in a controlled and effective manner. He also began to study potential loopholes and weaknesses in the HOAs. Argument. Understanding their position, anticipating their defenses, and preparing counterarguments became a central focus. He thought through every scenario, considering how the HOA might respond to legal action, inspections, or formal complaints. By anticipating their moves, he could stay one step ahead. This kind of strategic thinking was second nature to him, honed through years of planning military operations. The HOA's overconfidence now became a liability for them, a flaw he intended to exploit fully. Part of his plan involved documenting the tenant's experience without causing them distress. He instructed the neighbor to observe conditions, take photographs, and note any irregularities. It was crucial to show that the tenants were unaware of the legal violation and that the HOA had acted independently. This information would help demonstrate the scope of misconduct and protect the officer from any claims of interference. It was a careful balance, requiring patience and precision, but it was essential for a strong, credible case. Throughout this process, he kept detailed records of every communication with the HOA. Emails, letters, and phone calls were all saved, cataloged, and analyzed. Any inconsistencies or admissions were highlighted, creating a comprehensive dossier of evidence. This documentation would later become the backbone of his case, providing clear, indisputable proof of wrongdoing. He understood that in any legal or strategic confrontation, evidence was far more powerful than emotion, and he treated it as such as he worked. He also reflected on the importance of patience. Military training had taught him that acting too quickly could lead to failure. While waiting for the right moment could ensure success, the HOA believed he was powerless, that his deployment made him a passive observer. He let them believe that. Every day he waited, every day he gathered information, increased his advantage. His patience was not passive. It was active. Strategic accumulation of power and knowledge. He also reached out to other residents in the community, discreetly gathering information about past HOA behavior. Without revealing his intentions, he sought to understand if this pattern of overreach had happened before. The more he learned, the clearer the broader context became. The HOA had a history of aggressive enforcement and sometimes questionable decision-making. This knowledge reinforced his confidence that a methodical, evidence-based approach would succeed. He was building not just a case for his own property, but a strategy that could prevent similar abuses in the future. As the days turned into weeks, his plan took shape. He had a complete understanding of the legal, financial, and strategic dimensions of the situation. He knew exactly what steps needed to be taken, what evidence was required, and what the potential outcomes could be. The emotional turbulence of the initial discovery had given way to a sense of control and clarity. He was ready to act, but he knew that timing was everything. The HOA's arrogance had set the stage. He simply needed to execute with precision. Throughout this time, he also maintained a strict focus on his duties abroad. It was a delicate balance, managing the ongoing responsibilities of military service, while simultaneously preparing for the reclamation of his home. Discipline, time management, and mental focus became critical. He compartmentalized his emotions and tasks, ensuring that neither would interfere with the other. This ability to operate effectively under pressure was one of his greatest strengths, and it allowed him to prepare thoroughly without compromising his performance. He even visualized the final outcome, imagining the day he would return and confront the HOA. Every detail was considered: how to present the evidence, how to handle the tenants, how to enforce his rights without unnecessary conflict. This visualization was not daydreaming. It was part of the preparation. By anticipating every possible scenario, he could respond calmly and effectively, ensuring that the HOA had no opportunity to manipulate or delay the resolution. Strategy, preparation, and patience were his tools, and he wielded them with confidence. The officer also recognized the importance of staying within legal boundaries. While anger and a desire for revenge might tempt some to act impulsively, he knew that success required adherence to the law. Every instruction to the neighbor, every legal consultation, every piece of evidence gathered was done with integrity. His discipline and respect for the rules would ultimately strengthen his position, while any misstep could weaken it. This careful, methodical approach would ensure that when he acted, it would be decisive and unassailable. By the time he completed this phase of preparation, he had created a framework that combined strategy, evidence, and patience. The HOA had unknowingly set themselves up for failure, assuming that his absence equated to weakness. He had turned what could have been a source of frustration and helplessness into an opportunity to demonstrate the power of let. Careful planning and disciplined action. Every document, every observation, every communication contributed to a larger plan that was ready to be executed when the time came. In these moments, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not from revenge, not from anger, but from the knowledge that he was prepared. That sense of readiness, that control over the situation, was a reward in itself. He had turned violation into strategy, betrayal into preparation, and chaos into order. And though he remained miles away from his home, he felt closer to it than ever, armed with the tools, knowledge, and patience to reclaim it fully and decisively. Months had passed since he first discovered the unauthorized rental of his home, and he had spent that time building a detailed, precise strategy. Now, as the date of his return approached, he shifted from preparation to action. Every detail mattered. Timing, evidence, and methodical steps would determine the success of reclaiming his property. He had learned that patience was a weapon, and now he would begin to use it to full effect. The first step was to ensure that his legal approach was airtight. He reviewed the documents again, cross-checking every email, notice, and record to make sure there were no gaps. He drafted formal letters outlining the violations and requesting immediate compliance with state property laws. He sent copies to the HOA, making it clear that he was fully aware of their actions and that their authority to rent his home without consent was null. The letters were calm and professional, but the message was firm. They had crossed a line, and consequences would follow. He also arranged for inspections of the property. Local inspectors, familiar with state regulations, were engaged to assess the condition of the house and verify that the tenants were residing there under the HOA's improper authority. Every inspection report was meticulously recorded, forming part of a larger dossier that would leave the HOA no room to maneuver. These steps were done quietly, without alarming the HOA, so that their overconfidence would continue to be their weakness. Meanwhile, he continued to rely on his trusted neighbor for real-time updates. The neighbor was instructed to observe any changes, take photographs, and report even minor irregularities. This included the tenant's activities, any maintenance or repairs performed by the HOA, and any financial transactions that could be traced. Each piece of information was another thread in the web he was weaving, creating an unbroken chain of evidence that could not be ignored. He felt a growing sense of control as he pieced together a complete picture of the HOA's actions. He also anticipated possible resistance from the HOA. They might argue that his absence implied consent, or claim that certain clauses allowed them to act as they had. He prepared counter-arguments for every scenario, backed by legal research and detailed documentation. By thinking several steps ahead, he ensured that the HOA would have no credible defense. The process reminded him of military operations, where anticipating the opponent's moves and planning contingencies was the key to victory. Part of his strategy involved preparing the tenants for the upcoming changes. He was careful to communicate without creating panic or fear. Letters were sent explaining that legal protections were in place and that they were not at fault. He wanted them to understand the situation clearly, protecting both their rights and his own. Their cooperation would be crucial in ensuring a smooth transition when the time came to reclaim the house. Throughout this period, maintained his focus on discipline and composure. Every communication with the HOA and the tenants was deliberate and precise. He avoided emotional language, knowing that anger could be used against him. Instead, he let facts, evidence, and strategic actions speak for themselves. He reminded himself constantly that the most powerful response was controlled, calculated, and effective, not impulsive. He also monitored the HOA's actions closely, noting any changes in their behavior. As he expected, they continued to act confidently, assuming he remained unaware of the full extent of their violation. This arrogance would be their undoing. He documented every instance where they overstepped authority or acted beyond their rights. Each entry strengthened his position, creating a paper trail that would leave them exposed once he took formal action. As the day of his return approached, he rehearsed the steps he would take in reclaiming his home. He visualized the meetings, the delivery of legal notices, and the inspection walkthroughs. Each scenario was considered carefully: what questions might be asked, how to respond calmly, and how to maintain control over the process. This mental preparation was as important as any legal or strategic move. By anticipating every eventuality, He ensured that he would not be caught off guard. He also reflected on the larger lesson of the situation. The HOA had assumed that absence equated to weakness, that distance and time would allow them to act with impunity. They had underestimated the power of preparation, patience, and strategy. This realization reinforced his commitment to acting decisively, ensuring that the consequences would be clear and undeniable. The violation of trust had become a test of his discipline, and he was determined to pass it with precision. On the day of his homecoming, he arrived quietly, avoiding any immediate confrontation. He first conducted an unobtrusive walkthrough of the neighborhood, observing the property from a distance and noting the tenants' activity. Everything aligned with the information he had gathered remotely. The HOA remained unaware of the depth of his preparation, continuing to act as though he had little awareness of their actions. This gave him a significant tactical advantage. He then initiated formal proceedings, delivering legal notices and presenting the evidence he had meticulously gathered. Every inspection report, photograph, email, and timeline was included, leaving no ambiguity. The HOA's representatives were visibly taken aback, their confidence wavering in the face of clear, organized documentation. They'd assumed that absence and distance meant they could act without consequence. Now they were confronted with the full weight of his preparation and strategy. The tenants were addressed with care, ensuring that they understood the legal context and their rights. They cooperated fully, following instructions and maintaining a respectful presence during inspections and communications. Their cooperation reinforced the officer's position, demonstrating that the HOA had acted independently and without authorization. Each step in the process was executed calmly, deliberately, and legally, leaving the HOA with no room to maneuver as the inspections and legal notices progressed. The HOA attempted to defend themselves, citing minor clauses and procedural interpretations. However, every argument was countered with precise documentation and legal references. The officers' preparation left them exposed, and their overconfidence quickly turned to panic. They realized that their actions had consequences far beyond their expectations, and the situation shifted decisively in his favor. Throughout this process, he maintained composure and focus. He understood that victory would not come from confrontation alone, but from a combination of strategy, evidence, and disciplined action. He communicated clearly, acted decisively, and ensured that every step was legally sound. The HOA's assumption that he was powerless had been their greatest mistake. The meticulous planning, patience, and strategic thinking he had employed transformed a potentially chaotic situation into a controlled, successful operation by the end of this phase. The HOA's authority had been challenged in a way that left them accountable for their actions. The tenants were informed of their rights, the property was secured, and the evidence against the HOA was irrefutable. The officer had successfully executed a plan that combined patience, strategy, and disciplined action, turning a violation into a demonstration of control and authority. The stage was now set for the final resolution, where the full consequences of the HOA's actions would become clear. Justice would be served. The day had finally arrived. Months of careful planning, patient observation, and strategic preparation culminated in this moment. He stood outside his home, taking in the familiar sights, the driveway, the garden, the windows he had polished countless times. Everything was the same, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. This was the home he had built and protected, and now it was time to reclaim it fully. Not through force, but through strategy, evidence, and the unwavering patience that had guided him all along. The first step was to approach the HOA formally, presenting the evidence he had meticulously gathered. Every email, inspection report, photograph, and document was laid out in an organized dossier. He calmly explained the situation, citing legal protections, property laws, and HOA regulations that had been violated. The representatives were visibly shaken, their previous confidence replaced by a realization that they had underestimated him. He did not raise his voice or display anger. His calm authority and detailed preparation spoke louder than any outburst ever could. The tenants, meanwhile, were addressed with care. They had been living in the home under the impression that the HOA had legal authority. He reassured them that they had done nothing wrong and explained the steps being taken to resolve the situation. Their cooperation was essential, and they responded with respect and understanding. By keeping the tenants informed and protected, he ensured that his actions were fair, measured, and legally sound. The situation could have been chaotic, but his approach turned it into a controlled process. As the legal notices and inspections took effect, the HOA's attempts to defend themselves quickly crumbled. They cited obscure clauses and procedural technicalities. But every argument was met with precise counterpoints supported by documentation. The chain of evidence he had assembled left them with no credible defense. The sense of overconfidence they had displayed for months now worked against them. As they realized their actions had been meticulously recorded and were indefensible, the balance of power had shifted completely. He also ensured that any financial discrepancies were addressed. Rent that had been collected without his consent was accounted for, and damages, if any, were documented and calculated. He demanded restitution not out of anger, but as a matter of principle and fairness. The HOA, now aware of the consequences of their actions, had no choice but to comply. The legal and financial frameworks he had prepared ensured that the resolution would be comprehensive, leaving no loose ends for future disputes. Beyond the documents and financials, he also emphasized accountability. The HOA board members were required to review their actions and acknowledge their mistakes. Some were removed from their positions, while others were instructed to participate in corrective measures. His goal was not to humiliate, but to ensure that the system was corrected and that similar violations could not occur in the future. The process was transparent, fair, and decisive, reinforcing the principles of justice and responsibility. Throughout the entire process, he remained calm and composed. His focus was on achieving a resolution that was both effective and measured. He understood that anger or impulsiveness could undermine his efforts, so he maintained discipline at every step. The patience and strategy that had carried him through the previous months now culminated in a successful and controlled reclamation of his property. Each decision, each action, and each communication reflected the careful preparation that had defined his approach from the beginning as the tenants were guided through the transition, and the HOA addressed the consequences of their actions. He walked through his home once more. Each room, each piece of furniture, each corner of the house felt like a reaffirmation of his discipline, patience, and perseverance. The violation that had once threatened to disrupt his life had been transformed into a demonstration of careful way, strategic action. He had turned what could have been a moment of chaos into a controlled, just resolution. Neighbors watched in quiet admiration as the situation unfolded. Many had assumed that the HOA's authority was absolute, and that a homeowner stationed overseas would have little recourse. His approach demonstrated that patience, preparation, and strategic thinking could overcome even the most confident overreach. The lesson extended beyond his personal victory. It was a reminder to the community that authority must always be accountable and that careful, measured action could correct even bold violations. In the days that followed, he worked to restore the property to its original state. Any minor repairs were addressed, the tenants were assisted in their relocation, and the neighborhood was reassured of the legal and ethical resolution. He took satisfaction not in revenge, but in the restoration of order and justice. The house, once a site of violation, had returned to its rightful state, reflecting the values of integrity, patience, and discipline that he had always upheld. He also reflected on the broader implications of the experience. Trust, once broken, could be rebuilt only through evidence, accountability, and responsible action. He had learned that strategic patience was more powerful than immediate reaction, and that careful preparation could turn a seemingly powerless situation into one of complete control. His military training had taught him these principles, but applying them in the context of his personal life had reinforced their value in unexpected ways.